In the last 24 hours, the United States Supreme Court issued an emergency ruling that has quietly, but dramatically, shifted how federal power and state authority interact across the country. This was not a full case with months of oral arguments, media build-up, or a lengthy decision released after deliberation. Instead, this ruling came through what's known as the court's emergency docket, a mechanism designed for urgent situations where waiting could cause irreversible legal consequences. And that alone is why this moment matters. When the Supreme Court acts on an emergency basis, it is signaling that something in the lower courts has reached a breaking point. These decisions are not routine. They are interventions, used when the court believes existing judicial practices may be operating outside constitutional boundaries or creating nationwide instability. This particular ruling was decided by a 6-3 majority, and while the vote count itself is important, what truly matters is what the court addressed. The decision directly confronts a practice that has become increasingly common over the last 2 decades, the use of nationwide injunctions by individual federal judges. To understand why this ruling is sending shockwaves through legal circles, state governments, and federal agencies, we need to slow down and explain exactly what changed, without hype, without political framing, and without speculation. What is an emergency Supreme Court ruling? An emergency ruling is issued when the court believes that allowing a lower court's order to remain in effect, even temporarily, could cause widespread or irreversible consequences. These decisions are often released quickly, sometimes late at night, and they typically deal with injunctions, enforcement pauses, or procedural authority. Importantly, an emergency ruling does not always resolve the full merits of a case. Instead, it clarifies how courts should behave right now while broader legal battles continue. That distinction is critical, because misinformation often starts when emergency rulings are mischaracterized as final judgments on policy itself. In this case, the Supreme Court did not rule on whether specific state or federal laws are good or bad policy. What it addressed was judicial power, specifically, how far lower courts can go when issuing orders that affect people who are not directly involved in a lawsuit. The core issue: nationwide injunctions. For years, federal district judges have had the ability to temporarily block laws or policies while legal challenges move forward. Traditionally, those injunctions were limited to the parties involved in the case, the people or organizations actually standing before the court. However, over time, courts began issuing nationwide injunctions, meaning a single judge could freeze a law or federal policy across all 50 states, even when only a small group of plaintiffs filed the lawsuit. Supporters of this practice argued it created uniformity and prevented confusion. Critics argued it gave extraordinary power to individual judges and distorted the constitutional limits of the judiciary. What the Supreme Court addressed in this emergency ruling is not the political outcome of any specific case, but whether this practice itself aligns with the Constitution's structure. Why this moment is different. This ruling did not come out of nowhere. For years, multiple Supreme Court justices, across different cases, have questioned whether nationwide injunctions were ever intended under Article 3 of the Constitution. What makes this decision different is timing and tone. The court did not merely express concern. It acted. By intervening through the emergency docket, the majority signaled that the continued use of broad, nationwide injunctions by lower courts is no longer something the Supreme Court is willing to tolerate without immediate correction. Legal analysts are pointing out that this marks a turning point, a shift from debate to enforcement of constitutional boundaries within the federal judiciary itself. Why the vote split matters. The 6-3 split reflects a deep philosophical divide over how courts should balance efficiency, fairness, and constitutional limits. The majority focused on a narrow but powerful principle: federal courts exist to resolve specific disputes between specific parties. When a court extends relief to people who were never part of the case, the majority argues, it risks transforming judges into policymakers rather than neutral arbiters. The dissenting justices, on the other hand, raised concerns about inconsistency, inequality, and practical consequences, especially in cases involving civil rights, regulatory enforcement, and nationwide standards. This disagreement is not new. What is new is that the majority has now moved from theory to action. Why you're hearing about this now? This ruling arrives at a moment when the federal court system is already under intense strain. Across the country, Dozens of high-stakes cases are moving through lower courts involving immigration policy, election procedures, firearm regulations, healthcare mandates, environmental rules, and more. In many of those cases, nationwide injunctions have been used as a strategic tool by plaintiffs on all sides of the political spectrum to immediately halt enforcement of laws before appellate courts weigh in. By stepping in now, the Supreme Court has effectively told lower courts, this approach needs to change. And while this decision does not automatically dissolve existing injunctions, it strongly reshapes how courts are expected to issue them going forward. Why matters before we go any further? Before discussing political fallout, enforcement changes, or future implications, it's essential to understand this foundation. This ruling is not about a single law. It is not about a single state, and it is not about immediate winners and losers. It is about how power flows through the American legal system, who can pause laws, who those pauses protect, and where constitutional limits are drawn. But everything that follows only makes sense if we first understand what the Supreme Court just changed, and why it chose to do so right now. Once the Supreme Court released this emergency ruling, the reaction across the country was immediate, and unusually fast for the legal world. Within hours, state attorneys general, federal agencies, and private legal teams began reassessing active cases, not because laws had suddenly changed overnight, but because the rules of judicial intervention had shifted. This is where the real impact begins. How states reacted first, and why that matters. State governments were among the first to respond, and that's no accident. For years, states have been both beneficiaries and victims of nationwide injunctions. Depending on the case, a single district court ruling could either protect a state's law or instantly shut it down across the entire country. After this ruling, multiple states signaled that they are now preparing to move forward with enforcing laws that were previously frozen, not because courts ruled those laws constitutional, but because the scope of existing injunctions may no longer be legally sustainable. This creates a fundamentally different legal landscape. Instead of waiting for one nationwide decision, states may now operate under geographically limited court orders, meaning enforcement could resume in some places while remaining paused in others. That kind of legal fragmentation is something courts, lawmakers, and administrators have tried to avoid for decades. And yet, the Supreme Court has now made clear that avoiding complexity cannot override constitutional limits. What this means for ongoing federal lawsuits. Across federal courts, there are dozens of active cases that rely on broad injunctions as their central enforcement mechanism. Many of those cases involve immigration enforcement rules, election administration procedures, firearm regulations, healthcare mandates, environmental and regulatory compliance. Under the old approach, a single favorable ruling in one district could immediately reshape policy nationwide. Under the new framework implied by this ruling, that strategy becomes far less reliable. Plaintiffs may now be required to file lawsuits in multiple jurisdictions, seek relief that applies only to named parties, accept that enforcement may vary state to state during litigation. This doesn't eliminate legal challenges, but it makes them slower, more expensive, and more fragmented. Federal agencies are now in a holding pattern. Federal agencies were also forced into immediate internal review. When nationwide injunctions are weakened or restricted, agencies face a critical question: where can enforcement legally resume, and where must it remain paused? That uncertainty is not theoretical. Agencies must decide whether to reactivate enforcement actions, whether to issue updated guidance to field offices, whether existing compliance rules still apply uniformly. The problem is that emergency Supreme Court rulings often provide direction without detailed instructions. Lower courts are expected to interpret and implement the ruling, but until they do, agencies operate in a gray zone. This creates a short-term freeze, not because the court ordered one, but because no one wants to act too aggressively and trigger additional litigation. The political impact without political rhetoric. Although this ruling is procedural, not legislative, its political implications are impossible to ignore. Governors and state lawmakers on different sides of the political spectrum are interpreting the decision in very different ways. Some see it as a restoration of state authority. Others see it as a risk to uniform rights and protections. What's important to understand here is this. The Supreme Court did not endorse any specific policy position. It reshaped how legal challenges function. But because so many high-impact policies depend on court-ordered pauses, this ruling indirectly affects nearly every major national debate. And that's why reactions were immediate. Why legal strategy is already changing. One of the least discussed, but most significant, effects of this ruling is how it alters litigation strategy itself. For years, legal teams have engaged in what's commonly called forum selection, choosing where to file a lawsuit based on precedent, judicial philosophy, or historical outcomes. Nationwide injunctions made that strategy extremely powerful. Now, that advantage is shrinking. Legal experts are already advising clients that single district victories may no longer produce nationwide impact. Appeals will become more critical, not less. Coordinated multi-state litigation may replace single case challenges. This shift doesn't favor one side permanently. It changes the battlefield entirely. Why this creates short-term uncertainty? Perhaps the most important takeaway from this section is that the ruling creates instability before it creates clarity. Until lower courts reinterpret existing injunctions, and until appellate courts weigh in on how far this ruling extends, there will be confusion. And in the legal system, confusion has real consequences. Laws may be enforced in some areas but not others. Individuals may face different legal standards depending on location. Governments may hesitate, delay, or overcorrect. This is not chaos, but it is transition. This Supreme Court emergency ruling doesn't just change how courts issue injunctions, it forces the entire country to confront a much deeper question about how law actually functions in a federal system. Because once nationwide injunctions are no longer the default tool, uniformity disappears, and the consequences reach far beyond courtrooms. When rights start depending on geography. One of the most serious implications of this ruling is that legal protections may now vary based on where a person lives, or even where a lawsuit was filed. Under a system of geographically limited injunctions, a law could be blocked in one district, fully enforced in another, and legally unresolved everywhere else. That creates a reality where two citizens, subject to the same federal law, may experience entirely different legal outcomes depending on location. From a constitutional perspective, this raises a critical tension. Is equality under the law defined by national standards, or by judicial boundaries? The court did not directly answer this question. Instead, it prioritized constitutional structure over practical consistency, the civil rights dilemma. Civil rights advocates have raised immediate concerns about how this framework affects vulnerable populations. Historically, broad injunctions have been used to halt discriminatory practices, force systemic changes, prevent ongoing harm while cases are litigated. Without nationwide relief, plaintiffs may be required to relitigate the same issue across multiple courts before meaningful protection is achieved. That process takes time, money, and legal resources that many individuals and organizations simply do not have. The court's majority did not deny the importance of civil rights protections. However, it made clear that procedural limits cannot be ignored, even when the consequences are uncomfortable. This places pressure not on courts, but on Congress and lawmakers, to address gaps through legislation rather than judicial expansion. Election law, the most volatile impact area. Few areas are more sensitive to legal fragmentation than election law. Election systems require predictability, advanced planning, uniform rules for administration. If injunctions affecting voting procedures are narrowed geographically, election officials could face impossible scenarios where different counties operate under different legal standards. Rules change shortly before elections. Compliance becomes legally ambiguous. This ruling doesn't change election laws directly, but it changes how fast and how broadly courts can intervene, which may reshape election litigation strategies nationwide. Business, healthcare, and regulatory uncertainty. Beyond civil rights and elections, the business and healthcare sectors are already reassessing compliance strategies. Companies operating in multiple states rely on clarity. When regulations are blocked nationwide, planning is straightforward. When enforcement varies by district, compliance costs increase dramatically. Healthcare providers face similar challenges, especially where federal rules intersect with state authority. Regulatory uncertainty affects insurance coverage, medical compliance, long-term planning. This ruling introduces a transitional period where stability depends less on law itself, and more on how quickly courts adapt. The Supreme Court's broader message. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of this decision is how it was delivered. By using an emergency ruling rather than a full case with oral arguments, the Supreme Court sent a clear signal. Lower courts are expected to adjust immediately. This reflects a broader pattern of the court asserting tighter control over judicial procedure, especially where it believes constitutional limits have been stretched. Whether one views this as necessary correction or judicial overreach depends on perspective. But the message is unmistakable. The rules have changed, and the judiciary must follow. What happens next? In the short term, expect legal uncertainty, conflicting interpretations, rapid litigation adjustments. In the long term, this ruling may reduce strategic forum shopping, increase pressure on Congress to act, reshape how nationwide policy disputes are resolved. This is not the end of legal battles, it's a structural reset. The Supreme Court has not decided which policies should win. It has decided how power is exercised when those policies are challenged. And that distinction may define American constitutional law for decades to come. For clear, factual, and responsible coverage of major legal developments like this, without hype, without misinformation, this is exactly the kind of analysis we focus on here at LawPulse News.